Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Preston Miller. I'm an assistant professor in the University Libraries at Virginia Tech, along with my colleague, Ladeo Winling. He's an associate professor in the Department of History at Virginia Tech also. And today we're going to be talking about identifying patterns of racial discrimination through natural language processing. So the agenda for today is looking at what we call a racially restrictive covenant. I'll get more to that in a moment. This collection of documents of these covenants, which are real estate agreements for property. So we have these documents that we want to scan and OCR. So what type of visual transformations do we need to do the final optical character recognition OCR results? And then with the interest we're looking at is, since these covenants are way back in the day, in the early 20th century, we want to see how they change over time, the similarities and differences between these covenants. Talk about lessons learned through this process and our future work. So first, what is a racially restrictive covenant? These are property contracts that were meant to restrict people of color in either ownership of land or even taking up residence. These contracts range from the 1910s to the 1950s, and they were widely used, and which means there were so many of them that a lot of them are hard to track down. And so currently what we're looking at in this project is the covenants from Cook County, Chicago, Illinois. And this is of interest because Chicago is home of the National Association of Realtors, and they advise and shape real estate practices across the country. So this is a very pivotal place to study in this case. And also, there was a 1940 Supreme Court decision that changed practices within the city and county with respect to racial discrimination and aspects of that, unfortunately. So my disclaimer is the documents that you'll be seeing do contain what would be considered by today's standards offensive terminology. So our research interest, as I've mentioned a little bit about, is we would like to assess the variations of these covenants language and how things are described across geographies, state by state, and across time. And this is in part in response to legal challenges or local practices, specifically that Supreme Court decision I mentioned earlier. And also identifying the racial definition clause and how this changes over time. So let's dive into what these covenant documents look like. So the documents themselves are fairly old and were scanned at a very high resolution. However, due to age, there is fading. The fading makes the lines of letters thin and sometimes very weak or breaks the letters themselves. As you can see in these examples, there are a little breaks in some of the letters and some have faded. And the background is not white or near white, so there's less contrast. So also, here's an example of one of the more challenging documents that we have come across. And I've kind of blown up a couple sections of it so you can kind of see exactly what we're working with. I actually tried using Visual NLP Spark OCR on this without doing any transformations. And actually, the OCR didn't pick up anything. But when we do some transformations, we are able to get something. So one of the challenges, as I will describe here, is the background is not completely white. I mentioned that earlier, and it is fairly dark in places. So the pipeline for visual transformations that we discovered through experimentation has several very key steps, specifically getting to scaling, doing a median blur, adaptive thresholding, and inverting the colors of the image. So I'll go through each of these steps and show what they do to the document that actually help the OCR pick up the text. So first we do a 2x scaling, which is good practice. Even though the high resolution, we observe that scaling it even more increased the accuracy. And we perform a median blur because some of the letters are actually, as I mentioned earlier, thinner and may have breaks in them. So blurring them actually makes the lines a little thicker and closes some of those gaps. For example, the word hand here is kind of thin and a little hard to see on the top. And we look after the blur, the lines become thicker, becomes bolder, and it's a little easier to see, which is good because when we do the adaptive thresholding, it pulls out the back. It was able to pull out the background, and we lose a little bit of the letters, but not enough to where the OCR cannot pick it up. And so as you can see now, it's looking a lot more clear, a lot more distinct. And one thing we discovered is if you invert the colors of the image, it actually makes the OCR perform even better, which it's not something I thought at first, but as through experimentation of the different transformations available through Visual NLP Library, this actually worked incredibly well. And so here's an example of the final OCR. And with respect to all the transformations and the result. Now, there are a few errors here and there, but it's amazing how this package is able to pick up some of these words, even though some pieces are still a little broken up, like the word paid here, or acknowledged. And here is one of the more average documents that we've seen. And the results here are actually, are more accurate because it's clearer, but we do perform the same transformations across all the documents, so it makes it even that much better. So what our interest now we're coming back to our research questions. Now that we have these covenants scanned, OCR, we're able to get text out. So now we can start looking at what are the similarities between the language of these covenants and what are the differences. So we thought maybe we can look at the sentence level and see if we can find sentences in all the documents that are similar and different. To do this, we perform something. First, we have to tokenize the sentences out, means separate them into individual sentences. And then we apply Google's universal sentence encoder on each sentence. Now, what this does, it takes each sentence and puts it into a high-dimensional vector space, where two sentences vectors, if they're closer together, that means they're more conceptually similar. So this is an extension of word embeddings, where words that are closer have a similar meaning. And then we use a dimensionality reduction algorithm called t-SNE to plot this information, these results, in a 2D space. And so the result is each dot here is a sentence. And so all the clustering, all different clusters represent sentences that are very similar. And it's interesting that the universal sentence encoder was able to pick up all the OCR errors and what I call OCR junk in this section that I have highlighted. But this is interesting, but let's go ahead and take a closer look. I'm going to show you a couple different views of this data and kind of explore what we can see in this data. Okay, so what we have here is the same picture we saw, except for the colored dots represent the different covenant documents. And so this is one filtering that we can do with the documents. And thankfully, now that I'm using Plotly in Python, so I have a very nice interactive visualization. And if we start hovering, we can see the covenant ID, the year, and the sentence. And so this is the area that I'm in right now that I said was kind of OCR errors or OCR junk, things that don't add anything useful and meaningful to what we're looking for. And so now we see just short sentences that don't mean much. And then we start getting going the left. We're starting to get some numbers and addresses, but we're not really interested in this information. So I can go ahead and just zoom into what we're interested in. And this view with showing documents is interesting if you're trying to compare against different documents. But really, we're looking at the years. We want to see how things change over time. So first, I'm going to look at different clusters and show that the OCR was able to pick up enough text that the clustering of their embedding algorithm was able to actually pick up the meaning of the text of the sentences. And so keep in mind, these are legal documents, which means that they're used a lot for different contracts. And so there's very little changing between contract to contract, except for little pieces of it. And so that's why we're looking at these over time. We're looking for those little changes with respect to, like I said, that court case, different types of terminology. And so this cluster over here on the left, is actually some legal speech that is very similar. And if you look at them there, and it's just over and over the different legal representation of a clause that we're not interested in. So that we put to the side. But one thing that is interest, I let Liddell, my colleague, I gave him this, and he's the domain expert. He started looking at this, and he said, "Okay, over here, we're talking about people's heritage. They're 1/8 part or more of a certain kind of blood. The different types of representations and descriptions of what is colored and what is not." And so that is the place that he is of interest. That's where we see where are the similarities, where are the differences, how are the descriptions, what do they look like? And so that area on the top here is where you see that. And over here, this section is talking about pronouns and descriptions of gender and everything. And so that's really nice, because now we can look at these historical documents, and because of the OCR did such a great job, we're able to pull out the meaning and analyze these documents in a way that we couldn't before. But one thing I mentioned earlier, over time, so if you look at by decade, now we can get a little idea between the 20s and the 40s. And so we can see what was prevalent in each decade. And it's interesting, there's a blue cluster right here. It's everything in the 20s. And there's nothing related in the 40s. And then there's some red in the middle. Here, there was just the 40s. So you can start looking at the similarities and differences that we saw across the decades of these covenants. And sometimes there is the same legal descriptions over here in the 20s and some in the 40s. And then you can also do a color scale and count, but we only have 5 years right now, so the color scaling here is not as prevalent, but we can still look at differences in as it's going from the 20s to the 40s. But the one that I really like is this one. You can look across a decade, 2 decades, and do a comparison. So yeah, that is the result of the encodings that we're able to do. Our historian, Liddell, thought it was great. So let's go ahead, head back to, okay, head back to the presentation. So now, what did we learn through this? What did we observe? The experimenting with the visual transformations was completely necessary. Specifically, we thought in the ahead of time, after looking at the documents, what could be done to the documents to process them in a way that would make it clearer for the OCR to pick it up. And so that's what led us down the different steps and experimenting with different transformations. It thankfully didn't take too long, maybe a couple weeks. And so another thing we ran into, actually, a little roadblock, was we were working with very high resolution scans, which required a lot of computing resources. And so we had to change which systems we were working on. But after we got enough resources, it worked great. And one thing that is really nice, that the Spark OCR library worked so well after we did the transformations, they allowed for categorization of the sentences correctly. So the universal sentence encoder was able to take what the OCR output was and actually perform well. So we saw that the OCR was extracting things properly and the encoding was working well, which allowed us to do clustering and look at the similarities and differences across time. So the future work. We noticed that there are some OCR errors, specifically spelling, which is normal. So we thought, I believe in Spark NLP there is spell checker that we'd like to experiment with to see if that would make things even more accurate. And we would love to have a search functionality in the visualization. So all of those sentences, we can actually search for key specific terms that we're interested in seeing how they change and relate to other parts of the covenants over time. And we thought about looking at word co-occurrence networks and seeing how words relate in that way. And we also want to include more covenants. Right now, the data set I showed you was 17 of them. We have about 50 or 60. So ingesting those and processing them won't take too long. Just have to do it. And this will allow us to further investigate that racial definition clause and the restrictions of people who are agreeing to these documents and signing them. And so with that, I want to thank you for joining my talk, and I'll take any questions.